BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Westminster Hour with me, Ben Wright, and my guests. And as politics begins to wind down for the Christmas break, we'll take stock of the year now ending, in which Labour won a landslide but is running into problems from a stagnant economy to struggling public services. When will the government deliver the change it promised? How are the Conservatives faring under their new leader? And what of the big international challenges that lie ahead? If that all sounds potentially a bit gloomy, then fear not, we'll bring you some seasonal cheer with carol singing from the Parliament Choir. First, let's meet the panel. Once a Labour MP, Baroness Jacqui Smith was Home Secretary in the Gordon Brown government. After a lengthy spell outside politics, chairing two of the biggest hospital trusts in the NHS, Jacqui returned to office after this year's election, taking up a seat in the House of Lords and becoming the Minister for Skills. Jacqui, it looked like you'd happily swapped politics for podcasts, breakfast telly, the sequins of Strictly. Were you surprised to get a summons from Keir Starmer? Maybe he was a fan of your foxtrot, perhaps.
Well, I would hardly, given how long or not long I lasted on Strictly, that wouldn't have been a very good advert for me. No, I had a very nice life outside politics, but I was also absolutely delighted to be asked to come back into government in July for my third stint at the Department for Education.
George Freeman is the Conservative MP for Mid Norfolk. He is a former science minister, and before getting into politics, he worked in the tech and life sciences sectors. George describes himself as a Conservative reformer committed to decentralised growth, levelling up and regeneration. But after resigning as a minister last year, George, did you think about regenerating yourself outside politics? I remember you sounding pretty weary about the toll that it all takes.
Yeah, I did think long and hard about it. And I think one of the truths of modern politics is it's brutal. It's a brutally hard game. And I think that the new ministers will find that out. And it's knocking people over. 75% of my intake in 2010 have gone. So it's an incredibly high attrition rate. But in the end, if you've got the bug, I think it's difficult to resist. And also this country is in a terrible state. And it needs, I think we do need people who can recycle. If I've got any lessons that I can help share after 14 years, then I think I have a slight duty to share them.
Sir Anthony Seldon has many strings to his bow. Historian, educationalist, political sage, author. He's written biographies of 7 prime ministers since John Major, with more, I am sure, made the sort of errors that this one has so soon into office. I mean, we've had the Sue Gray saga, the abrupt cut to pensioner winter fuel payments, a massive tax-raising budget that certainly wasn't mentioned in your party's manifesto, the weird saga of the Prime Minister taking free clothes from a donor. Blair and Brown, you just don't think would have got into those sorts of scrapes.
Well, I remember Bernie Ecclestone situation being quite difficult at the time, back in 1997. But what we also didn't have, we had Gordon Brown saying we're going to stick with the last government's spending plans when we came into government in 1997. We didn't have the enormous fiscal challenge that we've had this time. It is genuinely true that not only was there the black hole that we thought there was going to be before the election, but then we arrived in government and found a whole load of commitments where the money just simply ran out or hadn't been found in the first place. In the Department for Education, we had the pay review body for teachers sitting in the drawer waiting for somebody else to make a decision. I mean, I think that's sort of the reason why Rishi Sunak went as early as he did go, because he knew those problems were coming down the track and he bailed before he had to deal with them.
Anthony, I think you thought that Keir Starmer's government had the potential to be a transforming one. It's
Well,
very
the country-
early days.
The
It's very
country
early
certainly
days.
needs it, Ben. The country desperately needs to have a proficient, clear-sighted government that introduces the changes, that gets growth above all, introduces changes to public services and restores confidence in government and trust in government. Look,
And what's your early
I mean, as Jess said, and as Jacqui said, the lot that's happened, and therefore the question is, why have they not got credit for it? And Keir Starmer, yes, he's not a charismatic figure, but, he's serious, he's bright, he's quick, he's decisive, he's ruthless when he needs to be. I mean, he hasn't got it right. He's made some terrible mistakes, above all, not getting his team ready for Downing Street. Why didn't he listen to the Institute for Government, or all those other people who would say, look, it's not rocket science. This is how you do it. You get your plan ready. And I think that what's happened, Ben, is that there hasn't been an overall sense of clarity. There hasn't been a sense of composure, assurance and calm about what they're doing. It's been jerky. There are too many 5s of this and 6s of that and 3s of that and 8s of this. And people don't want that. They just want proficient government. They don't want to have the kind of mistakes that he's made. So I think that, look, if he gets it right, Jack is right that all prime ministers have missteps at the beginning. If he gets it right now, I think people will quite quickly forget the errors of the first few months and take him afresh and take the government afresh. But he has to get it right, because I think if he comes back and with the May elections coming up, and if he doesn't do well in that, and with a huge challenge from reform, which is probably much bigger than we think it is at this point in history now, and chipping away at his conservative inclined voters himself, then the party, the MPs will start getting worried already. We've got, Gordon Brown. Everyone knew that he wanted to succeed Tony Blair. Everyone knew that he thought he was much better. But, the comments from Angela Rayner, from Wes Streeting, yes, sure, it's a joke at the moment, but, it's going to get bigger. And so he has to sort it out. He needs a long, deep break over Christmas and the New Year, and to rethink how to do it, and to listen to lots of the wise heads who are around to say, this is what you need to do. He's got, I think, the capability to be the kind of prime minister in a kind of Attlean, slightly sort of dull, mechanical kind of way, but highly proficient way that the country needs.
George?
Well, I agree with Anthony that there's a sort of Attlee-esque-ness about Keir Starmer, but I've been really stunned by just what a terrible first 6 months it's been, and I don't, in saying this for a minute, excuse the fact that my party's delivered vast amounts of chaos in the last 5 years. But I think it's revealed two things which the others have both touched on: a lack of a real mission other than just to kind of take over from the Conservatives, to get the Conservatives out, and there's no doubt that's what people wanted. But I don't think there's any clear, compelling vision of what this government, of what it really will judge its own success by. And it's in particular, secondly, how it's going to stop people getting poorer. And I think that's the real key, the underlying structural economics. Basically, government in this country is pretty bust. It's really struggling. The Treasury is struggling. Whitehall is struggling. And people know it. And I think what's happened is people's trust in the machine of government, of Whitehall, of Parliament, to make their lives better has been broken, really broken.
You said the government needs a compelling vision. Does your party have one yet?
Well, it's coming.
Last time you were on this programme, you said you thought your party was fundamentally broken and that deep questions about what had happened just simply weren't being asked.
Yeah. So
where are we now, do you think?
I do. I'll come to that. But just on, I think the really big gap for the Labour Party is their very public sector, their very public sector process. I don't think they have any sense that talking down the economy in the lead up to the budget. I've never seen such a flight of private sector enterprise and capital, and I think that's their real challenge: is how do you get private sector confidence?
About the economy in a minute.
In terms of our recovery, I mean, I think it's a long journey. We've got a long, big mountain to climb. But I think in Kemi, we've achieved a huge number of things. Firstly, she is a genuine fresh face, and I think she's at one bound pretty free of the chaos of the last few years. People aren't holding her responsible for the Boris Johnson or the Liz Truss stuff. I think she's a warrior for a conservatism of core values. So I think she's absolutely right not to leap for policy quickly, but to
Well, there isn't any policy, is there?
No, and there doesn't need to be. As William Hague said, in the beginning, what you need to make clear is that you are a movement driven by some values. I would suggest opportunity, enterprise, responsibility, big values. And then you set out a programme for government. And I think she's embarked on a huge process of reform of both value set and the party. But there's a mountain to climb. I don't dispute that.
But
for a minute.
there's not much evidence of that happening, though, George, is there? There's not much sort of introspection or you say she's a fresh face, but she was part of the last government and there isn't a lot of owning of what went on. Whereas the thing about Keir Starmer, and this is probably part of the challenge and the reason why perhaps, there hadn't been as much planning in opposition is, remember, it was only 5 years ago on Friday that Boris Johnson won that general election. Keir Starmer, it was a relatively short period of time as leader of the Labour Party in which he had to essentially rebuild the Labour Party. And there he showed himself, and you used the word, Anthony, as ruthless and effective in putting the party, as we would describe it, back into the service of the British people. But I haven't seen any evidence that Kemi Badenoch thinks that that's an important thing to do for the Tories.
Well, I've been listening to her speeches. She's been going around giving very, very thoughtful speeches. The other night I was at the Centre for Social Justice. She was incredibly powerful. It wasn't a pre-scripted set piece. It was her unpacking why, for her, being a warrior for social justice is one of the key pillars of conservatism.
She's also talked about the rise of the bureaucratic class, which is something she doesn't like, and she criticised people who, in her words, were living off the law. Do you get a sense of what she's trying to do with the party, Anthony?
She is trying to win a general election and she's trying to define something clean for the Tories, which is different to reform. Now, the Conservatives are the most effective force in any country's history of democracy. I mean, they are mean, cruel animals, and they will eat anyone and get rid of any leader to keep power. And I think she will be doing that. And I think it's an extraordinary thing for Britain that she is the leader of the party. The question is, can she, on this really bad wicket? I mean, why do we think that she will do better than the 5 Tory prime ministers from 2010 onwards who collectively were responsible? They did very good things. Education was one, but overall it was the weakest period of Conservative one-party domination since the party was formed in the 1830s and 1840s. So I think that, George, there's got to be real reasons for thinking that she can do better than they did.
She's got this whole thing, hasn't she, about kind of resetting the narrative, going back to first principles, but it's quite difficult to square that because she also then suddenly leaps on, yes, we'll restore the cut on VAT for private schools, or yes, we'll restore the farmers' inheritance tax. And she's kind of suddenly spends billions on these quite popular things that there's been a backlash about Labour about. So I think she's got to try and, over the next 6 months, kind of work out where she is on those things.
You're listening to the Westminster Hour with me, Ben Wright, and my guests, Jacqui Smith, George Freeman, Anthony Seldon and Jessica Elgot. Well, before Keir Starmer can kick back for Christmas, he has a date with the House of Commons Liaison Committee on Thursday, comprising the chairs of all the other select committees. It's been grilling Prime Ministers since 2002, and the questioning can range far and wide. It doesn't have the pantomime of PMQs, and the scrutiny is more in-depth. I've been talking to the Liaison Committee's new chair, Labour's Dame Meg Hillier, to find out what Keir Starmer might expect.
We are the only forum where the Prime Minister of the day has a long format interview, if you like, or discussion with senior politicians or indeed with anyone. I mean, there aren't any journalists who even get an hour and a half with the Prime Minister. So we take that very seriously and we want to make sure we're trying to ask the questions that matter to the voters.
And the Prime Minister appearing in front of the Liaison Committee began in 2002 with Tony Blair. And I think in the early days it struggled to work effectively. Too many MPs wanting the spotlight, a degree of scattergun questioning. How do you stop it becoming a bit of a superficial opportunity for senior MPs to show off in front of the Prime Minister?
Well, it's a good question because, politicians do tend to like the spotlight, but we are a team. We play a long game, if you like. We're mostly elected for the 5-year parliamentary term. So we get to know the areas that we're examining. But also, crucially, we are that voice collectively across Parliament for some of the big issues of the day. I do remember on one occasion, the Prime Minister of the day being asked about North Utsira and the shipping forecast. And another time when Theresa May was asked about Welsh lamb. Now, I'm sure with all due regard to Welsh listeners, Welsh lamb is very important. But she had a good long session about how she enjoyed going to her butcher. I'm hoping we can avoid that sort of discussion on Thursday, because this is the first session, of course, for the first Labour Prime Minister in 14 years, Keir Starmer's first outing in this respect. And we're all really keen to hear from him. And I think the country is about how it's gone, all the challenges that he's had to take on as Prime Minister. And it's a good opportunity for him to lay out his stall. Yeah,
there was another memorable evidence session when Boris Johnson was appearing and his entire government was collapsing around his ears. I think it was the last time we maybe saw him in Parliament as Prime Minister. But do you see this as a sort of end-of-term report card moment for the Prime Minister? And have you decided what themes you're going to focus on?
Understandably, I think you'd expect that we'd be asking about global affairs because he's been around the world a lot. Lots has been happening internationally. Obviously, public services is a big issue. It was a very big topic in the election and there's a lot of things on the agenda. We want to also talk, of course, about growth and the economy because that's the other big pitch of Labour government.
And you're, of course, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee as well. Is there a sort of conflict of loyalty that you feel as you're trying to press the Prime Minister to give you answers on these questions, but also, feeling that you are, you're a Labour MP?
Well, I am, but I'm also have been chosen to chair this committee. And I think we think very seriously our responsibility as scrutineers, whoever is in government. We don't do patsy questions. That would not be what we're there for because we want answers. Not a gotcha thing. It's about making sure that we understand, that the public understand what the Prime Minister's agenda is and that he can answer the questions that we're asking. So I don't see any particular conflict. My role is very clear, chairing my colleagues on Thursday. I don't think that the Prime Minister would expect anything different.
As you said, Meg, getting growth going is the government's number one priority. It sort of anchors everything else. Do you think that the Prime Minister has explained convincingly yet how this government does plan to grow the economy? There were more disappointing figures the other day on the level of growth just before the budget. The OBR has said growth through this parliament remains very measly.
It's got a big mantra, growth, growth, growth. We're going to be having the industrial strategy coming out next year and the spending review. I think what the Prime Minister tried to do in his relaunch, perhaps I
We're not allowed to call it a relaunch. Well, you're not allowed to call it a relaunch.
I'm not allowed, when he spoke at Pinewood Studios, was talking about how this would impact on people's everyday lives. And I think that is the challenge, that you can talk about growth at high level, in highfalutin ways, but actually, unless it's hitting the pockets of the people that you represent, then it's not really cutting through. And the business, indeed, the same for businesses. So very important that we get to the bottom of that. There needs to be, one, a clear strategy going forward, but also it is our job to challenge and test whether the things that have been promised are delivering. But 5 months in, I think we wouldn't expect it all to be resolved. But remember that the Prime Minister has traditionally appeared in front of the committee 3 times a year. We are hoping that this Prime Minister, with a big majority and a big, strong commitment to transparency, will increase that to 4 times a year, partly because also he's leading on the government missions and we need to be able to examine those. This is just the first stab at asking him questions 5 months in, and I think we'll be really all interested to hear what he's got to say.
Just on one other issue, I wonder if you're going to be asking him about immigration too, because obviously that's bound into questions about how to grow the economy. Is that going to be a focus of your questioning?
Well, I wouldn't want to reveal every detail of what we're going to be questioning. As I've said, we're going to be looking at growth in the economy, but also at global affairs and security. These are all issues that play into that agenda. So my colleagues are busy this weekend working with each other on their questions so we don't have duplication. I'm really the conductor of the orchestra on Thursday, so watch this space, Ben.
Labour's Dame Meg Hillier, chair of the Liaison Committee. Let's talk first a bit more about the economy and growth. Jacqui, I mean, growth is going backwards at the moment. People are seriously talking about a possible recession. You've got business leaders queuing up to criticise what they see as a tax on jobs that was the centrepiece of the budget. I mean, look at your own area, university funding. It sort of shows, doesn't it, some of the lack of joined-up thinking here. You know, we've got this national insurance rise on employers happening, which is hitting universities. You've also allowed universities to raise fees, which completely, which is going to cost the same amount or raise the same amount. They're now going to have to pay back in national insurance contributions. It doesn't add up, does it?
Well, the first thing that the government had to do, of course, was to put in place some of the economic stability that had been so seriously lost over the last 5 years. And that was what the budget was about, enabling investment therefore into the NHS and into our schools. That was important. And growth figures have been disappointing in the last month. But if you think about the basis which is now being built for future growth, the National Wealth Fund set up, the quite radical investment that will come from pension reform that Rachel Reeves has been talking about, the cap on corporation tax that we've put in place, the 10-year infrastructure strategy, planning reform. These are fundamental changes that will enable growth to happen.
But you also think that universities clearly are engines of growth. You think further education colleges are engines of growth, and they're being hit by this rise in NI for employers.
Well, it was important to get the public finances back in order that we can then invest in our further education, our skills. Of course, I want us to be able to find the money to invest in those things, but as we said in the election, unless we're getting growth into the economy, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And there has already been a lot of work put in place by Rachel Reeves and across the government that will create the conditions to enable that growth to happen.
George, the government has increased investment spending and wants, to increase growth with many supply-side reforms, house building, the drive for green energy in particular. Do you think that fundamentally is the right approach?
So I support the industrial strategy and I support they've maintained the figure I got us to at 20 billion on R&D. The only way we're going to get sustainable growth is to grow the industries of tomorrow. But I think they're really at sea here because they don't understand that growth must be led by the private sector and the public spend has got to be matched. So when Red Ed Miliband announces 21.6 billion for 2 carbon capture plants, 4,000 jobs in 2 Labour heartlands, that's 45 million a job, no private sector money. I think the public are going to start to conclude this is a government whose vision of growth isn't deploy public money to attract private sector co-investment.
Well, that's what GB Energy's doing.
GB Energy isn't... Well, we'll see what GB Energy does. These are all sound bites at the moment. The infrastructure 70 billion fund, we've already got the cabinet saying, hang on, we haven't got enough people to actually deliver. I don't think we'll deliver 70 billion pounds worth of infrastructure. I really fear after 40 billion of tax rises and changing the fiscal rules, the best the OBR could come up with is 1.5% growth. I think we're going to see much higher inflation. I think we're going to see lower growth. I fear that the last 6 months will bear out, and we're going to have stagflation. And before the election, people asked me, is this 92 or 97? Meaning, is this going to be a great, Tory escape under John Major or a hemorrhage? And my answer was it's more like 1974. Hugely high energy costs, huge inflation risks, global instability. So I think there's a big question over what the growth plan is. And I think the other...
Let me bring Anthony in. Do you think that comparison is widely off the mark?
No, I don't. I think they're echoes of the 1970s. I think they're also interesting echoes of the 1820s and 1920s, leading up to the Smoot-Hawley US a tariff act, which
I was about to mention that myself.
And Trump. So I mean, look, it's an incredibly difficult time for Labour to come into power. Differently difficult to Attlee and MacDonald. Much harder than it was for Wilson and for Blair. And but I think it would have helped. I mean, 5 months for the budget, 12 months, a year for the spending review. There could have been more of a clear sense of momentum, thinking, bringing in business leaders properly and strategically, woven into a narrative, and optimism, for goodness sake. I mean, we all need optimism. There needs to be. It's not difficult to, bring in superb people out there who can tell him how to weave a narrative for a premiership. Yes, it's going to be tough, but yes, we're going to get through. Yes, we're going to pull together. And this can give people the sense of, there's somebody who's up on the ship of the bridge, who is, up there and giving confidence that the ship's going in a clear direction. At the moment, I don't think there is that. I come back again, to what I said about this Christmas holiday. He needs to reset. This is his first chance for a proper reset. If he can learn the lessons, the things he didn't get right, and come forward with a much clearer narrative strategy and optimism. I mean, look, go back to Roosevelt in 33. You've got nothing to fear but fear itself. People need to have that sense. It's really grim out there. And Britain can get through it.
Would you gently encourage him to do that, Jacqui?
I've always encouraged the senior ministers that I've worked with to take a holiday because
come back with a compelling vision and a clear narrative of what the government's about.
Optimism.
Well, I think of course we need to be telling the story to the British people. Of course we do, and I think that started to be developed in terms of how we're going to make people's lives better last week with the plan for change, and I think some of the changes that have been made at number 10 have been about ensuring that there is the ability to be able to determine that and to communicate it. Of course, it's important to do that. But we also, of course, need to talk about what we have already done, quite a lot of which is lost in some of the day-to-day challenges that any government faces.
And importantly, and without getting too techie here, he has appointed his principal private secretary, such an important person in Downing Street, because that person shapes the Prime Minister's life, who is, she's brilliant, but she's non-Treasury. She hasn't worked in the Treasury, and now a cabinet secretary who is non-Treasury. There were two extraordinarily capable women who he didn't appoint. And so you've got somebody who's non-Treasury, head of the civil service and cabinet secretary and principal private secretary. He needs to get far more economic heft into Downing Street because he's not an economist.
And Jess, the new cabinet... Sorry, Sir Anthony. The new cabinet secretary, Sir Chris Wormald, starts tomorrow, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And a lot riding on him and that role, drawing the government...
And in him,
together,
he's got the kind of
civil service.
The one that we, in the media have written the least about. And I think that's probably the basis of his appeal, in that, he was the person who quietly sort of stepped in, while the current cabinet secretary, Simon Case, was not very well. I think that was one of the things that was seen to in his favour. He ran the Department of Health throughout much of the pandemic. You might think that was something where there are potential pitfalls as well in his backstory, but that's one of that parts.
He was a sort of Teflon character. Actually.
Yeah, and I think that's
he's very capable, but is he a reformer?
No, and I think that's one of the
and the civil service badly needs reform.
Yeah, but I think one of the things there were initially 3 people in Downing Street, 3 people in the marriage, and I think it's became clearer during the Sue Gray episode that actually having this kind of semi-civil servantish bent to the chief of staff wasn't really needed. What you needed was a very, very, very political person in the chief of staff, which he's got in Morgan McSweeney, and you needed a different cabinet.
It's so different to Blair's number 10, which was extraordinarily capable. And we're all agreeing that the challenge for Starmer is far worse than it is for Blair. He needs a top.
George, you're desperate to get in on this.
I just think most of my constituents, most voters listening to this conversation, I think they are angrier, they're less patient, they are not prepared to give governments the benefit of the doubt anymore. All this talk of Labour having a 10-year plan, the public aren't there. They want to know quickly have you got a plan to stop me getting poorer? Have you got a plan to get private sector investment? Are you going to cut immigration? Have you got a vision for Little Britain in a post-Brexit dangerous world? And I don't think Keir's got 5 years to develop a narrative. They want...
But that's
They want-
exactly
Can I
what,
just
that's exactly what was being spelled out last week.
Quickly back to the Cabinet Secretary and the Civil Service, though, because the other day the Prime Minister said too many civil servants were too comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline. I think a comment that made a lot of civil servants and unions very angry. You've both got a lot of ministerial experience, past and present. Did you relate to what he said? Jacqui?
I don't. It's not my view of the civil service that they are complacent. That isn't my view of them. But what they do set of challenges and priorities to organise around. And that's what was happening last week. And perhaps there hasn't been sufficient clarity about, OK, these are our early priorities precisely because we need to demonstrate to George's constituents that this is a government that is putting more money in your pocket, that's cutting the time you're going to have to wait to get into hospital, is making you feel safer in your communities, all of those things and more.
George, tepid bath of managed decline. Was that your experience of Whitehall?
I think there's an underlying structural failure in Whitehall that ministers of all parties are aware of. I don't blame it on a particular set of civil servants or a blob. I just think the way the machine is structured, we are really struggling. My experience has been that number 10s form quite small, tight cabals. There's a lot of 24/7 media leadership. The Treasury seniors are supporting that axis. Ministers who are leading quite powerful reforms, unless they've got very strong cover from the cabinet, tend to get hung out to dry. And I think that's why this clarity of what this new government actually is about is really urgent, because the civil servants otherwise will follow every different thing that's being discussed, and there won't be a clear drive from the centre.
Yes, let's turn briefly from central government to local government. Tomorrow, as I mentioned, we're going to get the government's devolution white paper promising a shake-up of local government in England. Another front in the government's growth agenda. What can we expect? More mayors?
Yes, more mayors. Devolution by default is what Angela Rayner will say, and that different places will get the new powers that many mayors have got almost by default. Lots of mayors want more powers, but they'll be given big sweeping ones about planning. We expect them to get ones to sort of call in projects, be able to sort of push through projects, all part of the big growth agenda. It feels slightly incongruous to be announcing this devolution white paper, because we've heard a lot in the past week about the centralisation of things. Ed Miliband's plan to centralise energy reforms, to basically let the ministers decide where wind farms are going to go. And now Angela Rayner talking about giving local people more power. How they run that narrative, I think, is going to be a challenge.
Jacqui, the Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, wants greater powers over post-16 education. This is your ministerial responsibility. He said, there's a big area where, in my view, it's not going far enough, he said to Laura Koonsberg today. The Department for Education takes a very centralising view of these things, but in my view, they're risking putting a brake on growth. Post-16 technical education is a local thing. You've got to work with the local market, local employers. Are you going to relinquish some control here, as Andy Burnham wants?
Look, we've devolved 60% of ADL's funding, and we will devolve more. And I've been talking to Andy and other mayors about what will really make a difference at a local level. Lots of the things that Andy wants to do, he can do, working alongside FE colleges. But I think actually what Angela is announcing tomorrow, not just in relation to skills, but a whole range of other areas, precisely helps to overcome some of the challenges about central government and whether or not it's joined up, because there are lots of things where it makes more sense for you to bring together a whole range of different players at a local and mayoral level in order to be able to solve problems. And that's what the government will be giving mayors the opportunity to do.
But you will be ceding more powers, more money.
We have and we will devolve more money to mayoral authorities. And as more parts of the country develop devolved arrangements, we will devolve to them as well.
Anthony, George.
Yeah, I'm a supporter of mayors. I thought it was one of Blair's better reforms. But in the end, the really key reform is the way Treasury allocates money across Whitehall. We're still running a system where if you deliver more for less, if you run a great hospital or a great FE college, we give you less and we give more to the people who are failing. And if you run a business like that, you'd be bust. And unless these mayors are incentivised to keep more of the above trend rate of growth that they can deliver or keep more of the savings, I fear we're just going to be handing out ever smaller pots of money from Whitehall. That's the really key reform. I think if they do that, we could unleash some local engines of growth all around the economy, particularly in my sector, in the R&D economy. There are 7, 8, 9, 10 clusters around the country that could grow at 5% if we could just let the mayors raise the money. But the Treasury's always been very anti that. So I think big questions for the Treasury on this growth agenda.
You want to say?
No, I'm all just for unleashing energy, entrepreneurship. I think the private sector has to do it, and government has to be permissive. But also the quality and the uptake on democracy. A third of people less voting in local government elections. That at least elected mayors have a bit of excitement, a bit of pizzazz about them. At best, sometimes no one knows who they are, at best. And we need to be really seriously thinking about regenerating trust and energy in our democratic system. Otherwise, this country's going to go the way of other countries in the world.
People do tend to trust local politicians more than they do, their national government.
Yeah, and if you look at the track record of local government these days, it's far more efficient than Whitehall. Far more efficient.
We're looking ahead to next year. The world beyond our borders could again have a very big impact on politics here, not least the return to office of Donald Trump. When it comes to international affairs, he's made it clear where he stands. The US will not be getting involved in Syria. On Ukraine, he thinks that can be sorted out in a day, he says. He's going to get tough with NATO members who don't pay their dues. Jess, give me a sense of what you feel the mood is in number 10 as they look forward to a change of US president in just, 2-3 weeks' time?
Well, Keir Starmer spent an awful lot of his time abroad in the first few months that he's in government and seeing a sort of ever-changing rota of world leaders. And he was, I think they feel reasonably pleased with how relations with Donald Trump have gone. They had that dinner, which everyone was quite surprised about how well it went, especially because David Lammy, the foreign secretary, has got some bad history with Donald Trump from when he was a backbencher. Of course, the main thing about Trump is that no one really knows what he's going to do, and he's incredibly unpredictable. He'll announce something in the morning, and by the end of the day, it's kind of fallen apart. If you speak to people from the Theresa May government who used to be on the calls with him, they would find it almost impossible to kind of keep him on track, keep him on message, and to do a readout to the media. They would, he'd been asking about the golf course. So of course there is that element of unpredictability, but I think they do think that they can, just about keep good relations going with some of the people around him in the administration.
Are you anxious about the Trump presidency, Jacqui?
Well, I think Jessica's right that people have worked pretty hard actually behind the scenes in number 10 and in the Foreign Office to build those relationships. So, I mean, it will be an interesting experience. It will be slightly unpredictable, but they are our most important partner for a whole range of reasons, particularly related to security, and we will work enormously hard to maintain that relationship.
Anthony, Keir Starmer's arriving in Norway tonight to discuss economic cooperation with the Prime Minister there. Then he's off to Estonia for a defence summit. He's come in for some stick, hasn't he, over the last 3 or 4 months for the amount of time he spent travelling, attending to international affairs. But it's hard to see that changing anytime soon.
Well, one of the things the Prime Minister does, I think that, and there were 14 trips in the first 130 days. I mean that's a lot. But the question is, are they on top of domestic policy? And what he needs to do is to get a clearer. Blair, to mention him again, had Prescott, and he had Mandelson, and he had Gordon Brown there, as well as an incredibly proficient and experienced team in Downing Street. And Keir hasn't got that yet, and he hasn't got his clear narrative. So I think there are question marks about that. Do I think America is going to be so important? I think that, as Jess said, and Jacqui was agreeing with, it's the unpredictability. I mean, simply nobody knows. He's going to be much more unpredictable than he was in the first term, where he was thinking about a re-election. He is completely, he is Trump unbound, and it's frightening. But I think that a more important relationship is going to be working with the EU, and somehow, look. Let's face it. The audit of Brexit hasn't worked out. It's hard to argue that Brexit has been a success, and that's, I think, the Tories are significantly to blame in not. They willed it, but they didn't get the benefits. And if the benefits are not going to be coming, then I think it's essential that Keir somehow aligns Britain more to the EU.
So I think Anthony makes a good point. My constituents, and I think millions of people, would say three things. They want to see a clear plan to control the completely out of control immigration. Secondly, some astute statecraft as Trump imposes tariffs on the EU. We're not in the EU. And I really want to see, my constituents want to see Keir navigate that and get Britain a good deal. And thirdly, security. Is he going to be able to use his goodwill in Europe to strengthen our backbone on NATO and Ukraine? Or are we going to see a really serious decline in the moral and military authority of the West?
Let's turn just quickly to another vital country for us, China. A big story this weekend, and it's in tomorrow's papers too, is about this alleged Chinese spy jet, at the moment just known as H6, but that could be about to change. We're expecting some moves in Parliament tomorrow.
Yes, I mean, it will all depend on whether there's a government statement or whether there's a UQ, but it's possible that his identity could be revealed or it could be revealed by the court lifting the anonymity order. But China, in sort of this guy aside, China is a huge focus for the government in the next year. It's a real thawing of relations that they're aiming towards. I think particularly Rachel Reeves is very keen on that, and she'll be visiting Beijing in the second week of January. They see it really as one of their sort of big options for economic growth. And that is understandably causing some unease, yes, from Tory critics, people like Tom Tugendhat and Duncan Smith, but also from some of the Labour backbenchers, who it's very difficult to sort of just stick on economics when it comes to China.
Yeah. I mean, Jacqui, the UK government now is in a complete bind when it comes to China, isn't it? On the one hand, there are these allegations of spying, China trying to infiltrate the heart of the British establishment, perhaps British universities too. On the other hand, economically, we're quite dependent on them. And your whole green agenda, getting cheap materials in from China, you are in a really difficult position here, and it's going to require some very tough choices.
Listen, we have said, I think legitimately, that what Keir Starmer has inherited as he came into government was a much tougher fiscal situation than previous prime ministers, a crumbling public sector, and actually a much more complicated global situation. So it's not just about the way in which the government has to think about its relationship with China. It's also, as we've discussed, the relationship with the US. It's about how we reset our relationship with the EU. It's about the future of Ukraine and our steadfast support, but how we move that forward. And then, of course, we've got Syria, Gaza, Israel as part of that challenge as well. I don't think there has been a prime minister who has inherited such a complicated global situation alongside those other challenges.
And I agree with Jacqui, but I think he's got to stop making excuses, blaming other people, the previous government, the Corbynistas, the unions, the civil service. He's got to be a leader. Trump will respect him far more if he's a leader. Who is the European leader who people respect from him? Giorgia Meloni. What does she do? She stands up. So he needs to be a much bigger, stronger force. And look at Attlee. I mean, take him an example. He was responsible for. He drove Indian independence. It was that Labour government that set up NATO, for goodness sake, in 1949. So, he needs to be not a supplicant. He needs to be a big person. Again, we're talking about him being very clear, not just at home, but abroad, what he believes in, what he stands for.
A lot of China hawks in your party, George, Ian Duncan Smith, Tom Tugendhat and others. Where are you?
Well, as Minister for Science and Technology, you see up close the global race and just how aggressive other countries are being in their attempt to build industrial sovereignty. And China, first amongst equals, they are incredibly aggressive. And I am quite worried that, if a growth plan is emerging and it's based on the public sector spending a lot of money on Chinese green technologies and opening up China trade, a number of our universities are hugely dependent on overseas Chinese students. I would like to see that balanced with much greater trade with the US, with our allies, with the Five Eyes, with Australia, with Japan, with Singapore. And I just worry that there's a view in the Treasury that China might be a quick route to 1% of growth, which we'll regret in a few years when we discover huge brain drain. They don't play by our rules. They don't respect intellectual property. They use the state. It's a communist party using and embracing aggressive industrial capitalism. So I think there's huge risks for us. And if that's our only growth plan, I'm pretty worried.
It isn't our only growth plan, which is precisely why I talked about the complexity of the global situation that the Prime Minister finds himself in, and the need to actually engage in all of those areas, including, of course, in the resetting of relations with the EU, our enormously important trading partner, which he's lent into.
And finding pure and fragrant people to trade with is increasingly difficult.
Yeah.
So we've just got to go in eyes wide open, holding one's nose if necessary.
Jess, I'm going to give you a generous 30 seconds to tell me about the front pages that we're going to be reading tomorrow morning, please.
We've got Andrew and the Chinese spy on another couple of the papers today on Monday. So the Duke's urge to stay out of sight for Christmas is one of them. The Guardian also writing about the potential to name this Chinese spy, alleged Chinese spy, in Parliament, and also new calls for the risk register for overseas nationals to be sped up. Telegraph's going on inheritance tax again. I think we're going to see another farmers' rally this week. Kemi Badenoch speaking at another one as well. That just won't go away at the moment for Starmer. And another one that won't go away for Starmer is winter fuel. 75,000 people face being left in the cold, says the Express.
Thank you, Jess. Well, that is almost all we have time for in this edition of the Westminster Hour, and indeed for this year. Thank you to my guests here, Jess Elgot, Jacqui Smith, George Freeman and Anthony Seldon. And thank you for listening. We're taking a break for a couple of weeks, and we'll be back with more political conversation in the new year. Parliament Choir. It's made up of MPs, peers and parliamentary staff, recorded at the recent Speaker's Carol service in Westminster Hall, accompanied by the Salvation Army Band. So from all of us here, goodbye and a happy Christmas.